Hello again, everybody, and welcome to assignment number 3 of Salem's Lot. I'm going to be starting specifically in part 1, the Marston House, chapter 3, the Lot, chapter 1. One thing I do want to say, and a very important thing, I just sent my daughters away from the room and I asked them not to listen to this book. While I want them reading it when they're your age, I certainly don't want them listening to it at their age. They're only 11 and 10. Make sure you're doing the same thing in your home. If you're listening to this out loud, you don't have earphones on, that you don't have any younger brothers or sisters or little kids around, because this book is extraordinarily over the top when it comes to its language. Stephen King wants to make the bad characters, not necessarily the bad characters, but the characters as descriptive as possible. And that means that they are going to speak using some very foul language and some very bad language. So please keep the kids out of there and don't subject them to this, please. But you, please enjoy it, and let's answer all these questions for assignment number 3, and let's look for our vampire characteristics and specifically links to Dracula. Okay, chapter 1. The sun is not slow to wake. Chores won't wait. Even while the edge of the sun lies below the horizon and darkness is on the land, activity has begun. The Griffin Boys, 4 a.m. All right, so this is important. I just want to point this out. So at this point, when everything is fine in the town, a normal day, at 4 a.m., these boys are up and doing the milking. They're probably not very happy about it. But just note that. A regular day, everybody's up even in the darkness. 4 a.m. The Griffin Boys, Hal, 18, and Jack, 14, and the 2 hired hands have begun the milking. The barn was a marvel of cleanliness, whitewashed and gleaming. Down the center, between the spotless runways which fronted the stalls on both sides, a cement drinking trout ran. Hal turned on the water at the far end by flicking a switch and opening a valve. The electric pump that pulled water up from one of the 2 artisan wells that served the place hummed into smooth operation. He was a sullen boy, not bright, and especially irked on this day. He and his father had headed out the night before. Hal wanted to quit school. He hated school. He hated its boredom, its insistence that you sit still for great 50-minute chunks of time. And he hated all of the subjects with the exceptions of wood shops and graphic arts. English was maddening. History was stupid. Business math was incomprehensible. And none of it mattered. That was the hell of it. Cows didn't care if you said ain't or mixed your tenses. They didn't care who was the commander-in-chief of the goddamn Army of the Potomac during the goddamn Civil War. And as for his math, his own, for Christ's sakes, father couldn't add 2 fifths and 1/2 if it meant the firing squad. That's why he had an accountant. And look at that guy, college educated and still working for a dummy like his old man. His father had told him many times that book learning wasn't the secret of running a successful business, and dairy farming was a business like any other. Knowing people was the secret of that. His father was a great one to sling all that bullshit about the wonders of education, him and his 6th grade education. He never read anything but Reader's Digest, and the farm was making 16 grand a year. Know people, be able to shake their hands and ask their wives by name. Well, Hal knew people. There were 2 kinds, those you could push around and those you couldn't. The former outnumbered the latter 10 to 1. Unfortunately, his father was a 1. He looked over his shoulder at Jack, who was forking hay slowly and dreamily into the first 4 stalls from a broken bale. There was the bookworm, Daddy's pet, the miserable little shit. Come on, he shouted, fork that hay. He opened the storage lockers and pulled out the first of their 4 milking machines. He trundled it down the aisle, frowning fiercely over the glittering stainless steel top. School. Fucking for Christ's sake, school. The next 9 months stretched ahead of him like an endless tomb. Foreshadowing. Sorry, I had something stuck in my throat there. Let's go, chapter 3. 4:30 a.m. The fruits of yesterday's late milking had been processed and were now on their way back to the lot, this time in cartons rather than galvanized steel milk cans, under the colorful label of Slewfoot Hill Dairy. Charlie Griffin's father had marketed his own milk, but that was no longer practical. The conglomerates had eaten up the last of the independents. The Slewfoot Hill milkman in West Salem was Irwin Purinton, and he began his run along Brock Street, which was known in the country as the Brock Road or that Christless washboard. Later, he would cover the center of town and then work back out of town along the Brooks Road. Wynn had turned 61 in August, and for the first time, his coming retirement seemed real and possible. His wife, a hateful old bitch named Elsie, had died in the fall of 1973. Predeceasing him was the one considerate thing she had done in 27 years of marriage. And when his retirement finally came, he was going to pack up his dog, a half-cocker mongrel named Doc, and move down to Pequawmet Point. He planned to sleep until 9 o'clock every day and never look at another sunrise. And it's Pemaquid Point. Pardon me. He pulled over in front of the Norton house and filled his carry rack with their order. Orange juice, 2 quarts of milk, a dozen eggs. Climbing out of the cab, his knee gave a twinge, but only a faint one. It was going to be a fine day. There was an addition to Mrs. Norton's usual order in Susan's round, Palmer method script. There was an addition to Mrs. Norton's usual order in Susan's round, Palmer method script. Please leave 1 small sour cream, Wynne. Thanks. Puritan went back for it, thinking it was going to be one of those days when everyone wanted something special. Sour cream. He had tasted it once and liked to puke. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, and on the fields between here and town, heavy dew sparkled like a king's ransom of diamonds. 15 a.m., Chapter 4. Eva Miller had been up for 20 minutes, dressed in a rag of house dress and a pair of floppy pink slippers. She was cooking her breakfast, 4 scrambled eggs, 8 rashers of bacon, a skillet of home fries. Oh, gee, that's her breakfast? 4 eggs, 8 pieces of bacon, and a whole thing of home fries? Woo! She would garnish this humble repast with 2 slices of toast and jam, a 10-ounce tumbler of orange juice, and 2 cups of coffee with cream to follow. She was a big woman, but not precisely fat. She worked too hard to keep in her place up to ever be fat. The curves of her body were heroic, Rabelaisian. Watching her in motion at her 8-burner electric stove was like watching the restless movements of the tide or the migration of sand dunes. She liked to eat her morning meal in this utter solitude, planning the work ahead of her for the day. There was a lot of it. Wednesday was the day she changed the linen. She had 9 boarders at present, counting the new one, Mr. Mears. The house had 3 stories and 17 rooms, and there was also floors to wash, the stairs to be scrubbed, the banister to be waxed, and the rug to be turned in the central common room. She would get Weasel Craig to help her with some of it, unless he was sleeping off a bad drunk. The back door opened just as she was sitting down to the table. Hi, Wynne. How you doing? Passable. Knees kicking a bit. Sorry to hear it. You want to leave an extra quart of milk and a gallon of that lemonade? Sure, he said, resigned. I knew it was going to be that kind of day. She dug into her eggs, dismissing the comment. Wynne Puritan could always find something to complain about, although God knew he should have been the happiest man alive since that hellcat he had hooked up with fell down the cellar stairs and broke her neck. 5:45, just as she was finishing up her second cut. Wait a minute, I have a little thing. This guy doesn't seem very nice, like a nice guy. He hated his wife, and she fell down the cellar stairs and broke her neck. Has nothing to do with the story or its being vampiric. I'm just saying. At 5:45, just as she was finishing up her second cup of coffee and smoking a Chesterfield, the Press Herald thumped against the side of the house and dropped into the rose bushes. 3rd time this week. Kilby Kid was batting 1,000, probably delivering the papers wrecked out of his mind. Well, let it sit there a while. The earliest sunshine, thin and precious gold, was slanting in through the east windows. It was the best time of her day, and she would not disturb its moveless peace for anything. Her boarders had the use of the stove and the refrigerator. That, like the weekly change of linen, came with their rent. And shortly the peace would be broken as Grover Verrill and Mickey Sylvester came down to slop up their cereal before leaving for the textile mill over in Gates Falls, where they both worked. As if her thought had summoned a messenger of their coming, the toilet on the 2nd floor flushed, and she heard Sylvester's heavy work boots on the stairs. She heaved herself up and went to rescue the paper. 6:05 a.m. The baby's thin wail pierced Sandy McDougal's thin morning sleep, and she got up to check the baby with her eyes still bleared shut. She barked her shin on the nightstand and said, "Ugh." The baby, hearing her, screamed louder. "Shut up," she yelled. "I'm coming." She walked down the narrow trailer corridor to the kitchen, a slender girl who was losing whatever marginal prettiness she once might have had. She got Randy's bottle out of the refrigerator, thought about warming it, then thought, to hell with it. If you want it so bad, Buster, you can just drink it cold. She went down to his bedroom and looked at him coldly. He was 10 months old, but sickly and puling for his age. He had only started crawling last month. Maybe he had polio or something. Now there was something on his hands and on the wall too. She pushed forward, wondering what in Mary's name he had been into. She was 17 years old, and she and her husband had celebrating their first wedding anniversary in July. At the time she had married Ruth McDougal, 6 months pregnant and looking like the Goodyear blimp, marriage had seemed every bit as blessed as Father Callahan said it was. A blessed escape hatch. Now it just seemed like a pile of kuka. Which was, she saw with dismay, exactly what Ryan had smeared all over his hands, on the wall, and in his hair. She stood looking at him dully, holding the cold bottle in one hand. This is what she had given up high school for, her friends for, her hopes of becoming a model for this crummy trailer stuck out in the bend, for Michael already peeling off the counters and strips, for a husband that worked all day at the mill and went off drinking or playing poker with his no-good gas station buddies at night, for a kid who looked just like his no-good old man and smeared kuka all over everything. He was screaming at the top of his lungs. You shut up, she screamed back suddenly and threw the plastic bottle at him. It struck his forehead and he toppled on his back in the crib, wailing and thrashing his arms. There was a red circle just below the hairline, and she felt a horrid surge of gratification, pity, and hate in her throat. She plucked him up out of the crib like a rag. Shut up, shut up, shut up. She had punched him twice before she could stop herself, and Randy's screams of pain had become too great for sound. He lay gasping in his crib, his face purple. All right. All right. You heard that. She had punched him twice before she could stop herself. This is her 10-month-old son. He lay gasping in his crib, his face purple. I'm sorry, she muttered. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, I'm sorry. You okay, Randy? Just a minute. Mama's going to clean you up. By the time she came back with a wet rag, both of Randy's eyes had swelled shut and were discoloring. But he took the bottle, and when she began to wipe his face with the damp rag, he smiled toothlessly at her. I'll tell Roy he fell off the changing table, she thought. He'll believe that. Oh, God. I'll believe that. The blue-collar population of Salem's Lot was on its way to work. Mike Ryerson was one of the few who worked in town. In the annual town report, he was listed as a groundskeeper, but he was actually in charge of maintaining the town's 3 cemeteries. In the summer, this was almost a full-time job, but even in the winter, it was no walk, as some folks, such as that prissy George Midler down at the hardware store, seemed to think. He worked part-time for Carl Foreman, the lot's undertaker, and most of the old folks seemed to poop off in the winter. Now he was on his way out to the Burns Road in his pickup truck, which was loaded down with clippers, a battery-driven hedge trimmer, a box of flag stands, a crowbar for lifting gravestones that might have fallen over, a 10-gallon gas can, and 2 Briggs & Stratton lawnmowers. He would mow the grass at Harmony Hill this morning and do any maintenance on the stones and the rock wall that was necessary. And this afternoon, he would cross town to the Schoolyard Hill Cemetery, where school teachers sometimes came to do rubbings on account of an extinct colony of Shakers who had once buried their dead there. But he liked Harmony Hill best of all 3. It was not as old as the Schoolyard Hill boneyard, but it was pleasant and shady. He hoped that someday he could be buried there himself, in 100 years or so. He was 27 and had gone through 3 years of college in the course of a rather checkered career. He hoped to go back someday and finish up. He was good looking in an open, pleasant way, and he had no trouble connected with unattached females on Saturday nights out at Dell's or in Portland. Some of them were turned off by his job, and Mike found this honestly hard to understand. It was pleasant work. There was no boss always looking over your shoulder, and the work was in the open air under God's sky. So what if he dug a few graves or on occasion drove Carl Foreman's funeral hack? Somebody had to do it. To his way of thinking, the only thing more natural than death was sex. Humming, he turned off onto the Burns Road and shifted to Second going up the hill. Dry dust spurned out behind him. Through the choked summer green around both sides of the road, he could see the skeletal leafless trunks of the trees that had burned in the big fire of 51 like old and moldering bones. There were deadfalls back in there, he knew, where a man could break his leg if he wasn't careful. Even after 25 years, the scar of that great burning was there. Well, that was just it. In the midst of life, we are in death. I just want to say, this is Stephen King's second novel. You may have seen a movie, either the old one or the new one, of one of his later novels. I don't know what number it was, probably like 10, 15, or 20, somewhere in there, but it's called Pet Sematary. And in Pet Sematary, of course, there's a deadfall in the back of the man's house. And the deadfall is a bunch of trees that have like fallen all down dead, and they've kind of stacked themselves up, and you have to walk onto them. And they're very dangerous because they can shift and whatnot. And your legs can fall in and you can fall in. But I'm just wondering, and it makes me think of, Stephen King likes to get his own ideas for his future books from his present books, and also he throws a lot of homages to himself, and he talks about his other books in his books. It's actually pretty cool. I'll be quiet now though. Okay. The cemetery was at the crest of the hill, and Mike turned in the drive, ready to get out and unlock the gate, and then brake the truck to a shuddering stop. The body of a dog hung head down from the wrought iron gate, and the ground beneath the mud was muddy with its blood. Mike got out of the truck and hurried over to it. He pulled his work gloves out of his back pockets and lifted the dog's head with one hand. It came up with a horrible, boneless ease, and he was staring into the blank, glazed eyes of Win Puritan's mongrel cocker, Doc. We just met Win Puritan, if you'll recall. He's the one with the dead wife down the mean dead wife who fell down the stairs, broke her neck, and he said what he wanted to do most than anything was to retire with that dog, Doc. Wynn's not going to be happy. The dog had been hung on one of the gate's high spikes like a slab of beef on a meat hook. Flies, slow with the coolness of early morning, were already crawling sluggishly over the body. I'm just going to say that again. The dog had been hung on one of the gates high, so it's not like the dog was just killed or something, but it was also hung on one of the spikes, like a slab of beef on a meat hook. Ugh. Mike struggled and yanked and finally pulled it off, feeling sick to his stomach at the wet sounds that accompanied his efforts. Graveyard vandalism was an old story to him, especially around Halloween, but this was still a month and a half away, and he had never seen anything like this. Usually they contented themselves with knocking over a few gravestones, scrawling a few obscenities, or hanging a paper skeleton from the gate. But if this slaughter was the work of kids, then they were real bastards. Wynn was going to be heartbroken. He debated taking the dog directly back to town and showing it to Parkins Gillespie. And we met Parkins Gillespie. He is the sheriff of town. Remember the guy who sits around and smokes? And decided it wouldn't gain anything. He could take poor old Doc back to town when he went to eat his lunch. Not that he was going to have much appetite today. He unlocked the gate and looked at his gloves, which were smeared with blood. The iron bars of the gate would have to be scrubbed, and it looked like he wouldn't be getting over to Schoolyard Hill this afternoon after all. He drove inside and parked, no longer humming. The zest had gone out of the day. 7, 8 a.m. You know what? It's actually a good place for me to stop. You are now in, everybody, so that you can pick it up when you pick up the book and read it yourselves. You are in Part 1, The Marston House, Chapter 3, The Lot 1. And then you go down until you find Chapter 7. It is at 8 a.m. And as you know, we've been going through the entire town. You know what? Yeah, I can read this one very quickly. Let me read this one. I'll read Chapter 7. I'll stop for Chapter 8. All right, Chapter 7, 8 a.m. The lumbering yellow school buses were making their appointed rounds, picking up the children who stood out by their mailboxes, holding their lunch buckets and skylarking. Charlie Rose was driving one of these buses, and his pickup troop covered the Taggart Stream Road in East Salem and the upper half of Jointer Avenue. The kids who rode Charlie bus were the best behaved in town, in the entire school district for that matter. There was no yelling or horseplay or pulling pigtails on bus 6. They goddamn well sat still and minded their manners, or they could walk 2 miles to Stanley Elementary and explain why in the office. He knew what they thought of him, and he had a good idea of what they called him behind his back. But that was all right. He was not going to have a lot of foolishness and shit slinging on his bus. Let them save that for their spineless teachers. The principal at Stanley Street had had the nerve to ask him if he hadn't acted impulsively when he put the Durham boy off 3 days running for just talking a little too loud. Charlie had just stared at him, and eventually the principal, a wet-eared little pipsqueak who had only been out of college 4 years, had looked away. The man in charge of the said 21 motor pool, Dave Felsen, was an old buddy. They went all the way back to Korea together. They understood each other. They understood what was going on in the country. They understood how the kid who had just been talking a little too loud on the school bus in 58 was the kid who had been out pissing on the flag in 68. He glanced into the wide overhead mirror and saw Mary Kate Griegson passing a note to her little chum, Brent Penny. Little chum, yeah, right. They were banging each other by the 6th grade these days. He pulled over, switching on his stop flashers. Mary Kate and Brett looked up, dismayed. Got a lot to talk about? He asked into the mirror. Good. You better get started. He threw open the folding doors and waited for them to get the hell off his bus. Chapter 8. All right, that's where we're really going to stop. Wow, this town is full of some really angry and mean people. What you also have to ask yourself about that. Why is that? What's going on with the town that produces people that are so darn angry and possibly evil? That seems kind of, I mean, is it evil to kick little kids off a bus because they're passing notes? I don't know if evil's the right word. It's downright mean. But the way he thinks and the way, because you're going into every character's head. You're getting to really see their personality and what they feel. He seems possibly evil to me. So you are now picking it up. I will say it again. You are in Part 1, The Marston House, Chapter 3, The Lot 1. And now you are in Chapter 8, 9 a.m. Enjoy the rest of assignment number 3, and I will see you tomorrow. Thank you, everybody.